Following the visual success of the Birmingham campaign in the spring of 1963, we see the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King, SCLC, move towards the March on Washington, which occurred in late August of 1963. And as you can see in the picture in the lower portion of your screen, just the attendance by the mass crowds. And we even have MLK's I Have a Dream speech, and just the impact of that, not only on the event itself, but on history, on history and society since then. So that's something that's been an important watershed moment for the Civil Rights Movement in terms of bringing whites and blacks together and really setting the civil disobedience nonviolent movement on good footing. But unfortunately, in addition to the violence of the 16th Street church bombing in Birmingham in September of 1963, and then JFK's assassination in early November of 63, and then LBJ's, JFK's vice president, his swearing in following the assassination, again in November of 63. The Civil Rights Movement was on a little bit of shaky ground, but that was eventually solidified due to the wide support following JFK's assassination for civil rights legislation. And really, many historians view the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as the most important series of civil rights laws passed since the Civil War. So since Reconstruction, since the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments had been passed and put into law, that Civil Rights Movement, or the Civil Rights Act of 64, was important because it outlawed desegregation, because it outlawed something that had been in place since Plessy versus Ferguson, since this whole idea of separate but equal, whether it was theaters, hotels, restaurants, any public space. It outlawed segregation. It forced integration. It forced whites and blacks to live together by law. That was vitally important to the Civil Rights Movement in establishing a certain level of equality. Even if they weren't actually equal in the eyes of society, they were equal in the eyes of the law, which up until then they had not been. But even with the Civil Rights Act of 64, the violence doesn't end. Even with the passing of the 24th Amendment that outlawed poll taxes in early 64, violence didn't end there. We see that despite all the progress against discrimination, against segregation, that civil rights workers, leaders, continue to face instances of violence, whether they were outright killed or just simply beaten unconscious and left for dead. And we see that one instance of this violence occurred during what became known as the Freedom Summer in 1964, which was a series of campaigns in an attempt to register black voters in the South. Because despite the Civil Rights Act and despite the 24th Amendment, the local governments in the South still resisted the registration of black voters because they knew that black voters would not vote for them in the election, so they were doing everything they could to prevent that from happening. If they were able to prevent the black population from exercising their right to vote, they would continue to be able to marginalize them in society. And we see the incident, the three individuals on the right-hand side of your screen, Andrew Goodman, James Earl Chaney, and Michael Henry Schwerner, were those three civil rights workers that were found dead in Mississippi in August of 64. So just about a month after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in July of 64. They had been participating in one of these Freedom Summer efforts. They were killed by several local KKK members, but given the climate of the South, the environment of the hostile environment towards civil rights leaders, none of their perpetrators were convicted or put on trial in the immediate effect, and only one of them was ever convicted, and even then, that was 41 years after the fact. So you still see the violence of the violence against civil rights leaders in the Deep South as coming up over and over again. And following this incident in the summer of '64, we see MLK and the SCLC turning towards Selma, Alabama, and turning towards refocusing their voter registration campaign to that area. And one of the instances that they seek to go after, or that occurred during this campaign, was something that became known as Bloody Sunday. Because we see that with the SCLC and SNCC attempting to register voters, but ultimately failing because of the resistance of these local officials, these county officials, in registering to vote, these activists sought to march from Selma to Montgomery, to the capital of Alabama. But in response to these marchers, state police met the marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on March 7th, and you see scenes of violence happening in the early morning hours of March 7th. And as if you watch the video that is attached, that is posted along to this Canvas page, that was from the movie Selma, that was supposed to document these events. Just the amount of violence that was inflicted upon these individuals as they were just simply walking across the bridge. We see state troopers using their billy clubs to beat back these marchers, using state troopers on horseback riding over these marchers, and they were dispersing them with tear gas. They were dispersing them with their billy clubs, simply for marching, simply for walking from one place to another. And we see this again, this just like the Birmingham campaign had galvanized the public against this violence, against the perpetrators of this violence in the form of the white supremacists in the Deep South. We see that happening again following Bloody Sunday. We see that happening again where it had been broadcasted on public television. So pretty much every television screen in the United States had witnessed, or every family that had a television screen witnessed these events happening. So they, again, like I said, it really galvanized the public in favor of the civil rights movement for the first time in a long time. But again, that still didn't end the violence, even though we see the Voting Rights Act being passed in August of '65. So a year after those three civil rights workers were killed, and the enforcement, the mass registration of black voters in the South. We see that some of the numbers going so far as tripling black voters in the South, and outlawing. And one of the ways it helped this, obviously, by making it illegal to prevent them from voting or prevent them from registering. But it also outlawed literacy tests, and as we had seen with that practice literacy test, that they were very intentionally aimed at keeping black voters from voting in the South. And one of the kind of the marquee moments prior to the Voting Rights Act was a speech made by President Johnson, was become known as the "We Shall Overcome" speech. And again, in that video clip of his speech, you'll see the imagery, the wording that he uses to attack Southerners and their ideology. But segregation still persists, and it's not that de jure segregation, not that legal segregation that we see in the form of literacy tests, grandfather clauses, poll taxes, but in terms of social segregation, where society prevents the individual through other means. So whether we see school busing, affirmative action, these instances where segregation is still allowed to continue and isn't fully overcome. And as we were talking about before, when we looked at Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, that King was eventually assassinated in 1968 by a man by the name of James Earl Ray, and he was caught months after the assassination, and he was eventually sentenced to 99 years in prison. But we see that the impact of Martin Luther King, despite the fact that he was assassinated in '68, that his impact and his legacy continued to secure progress for the civil rights movement. You see, even with the progress that it secured, that society today still has many steps to go, many ways to move forward. And we see even currently with the issues faced by the Black Lives Matter movement and other civil rights issues today, that the civil rights movement is not over, despite being 50 years after MLK's assassination.